You're very welcome back. Now, all oak trees grow from little acorns, but little did our next guest think in 1956 that his humble skiffle band would morph into the biggest music phenomenon the world had ever seen.
That Liverpudlian band, the Quarrymen, became the Beatles, and the rest, of course, is history. And Rod Davis was right there at the very beginning. And we're delighted to say Rod is with us this morning. Good morning, Rod.
Thank you.
Good morning, Rod. Welcome.
Shall we go back to the very beginning?
Yeah, I've never actually thought of myself as an acorn, but there you go.
Well, there you are. You've been called other things.
It's another thing for the CV.
A lot less complimentary.
Let's go back to the very, very start then, and the birth of the Quarrymen. How did that come about, Rod?
Well, I got to know John when I was 5 years old. He was in my Sunday school class. And then when we were 11, we both went to the same school, Quarrybank School. And in 1956, an Irish Scotsman called Lonnie Donegan came out with a song called Rock Island Line, which inspired thousands of youngsters to start playing guitars and things like that and form groups. They were always groups, never bands. And I was inspired by that, as was John and loads of other people. So one day I'd pestered my mum and dad to get me either a guitar or a banjo. And I turned up in school on the Monday morning saying, I bought a banjo yesterday. And a friend said, oh, do you want to be in a group? So I said, who's in it? So myself on guitar, Pete Shotton on a washboard, a guy called Bill Smith on the tea chest, and John Lennon on guitar. And they were all in the same year as me at school, and I knew them all. And so I said, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. So they knew I couldn't play. I'd only bought it the day before.
Because you didn't walk in saying, I can play this, by the way. You walked in and said, I bought it.
I bought it. Well, that was the problem, finding people who actually had an instrument.
Yeah,
you know.
Of course. Yeah.
I mean, my dad paid £5 for it in 1956, which was quite a few, tidy sum of money, you know. And so that's how it started. And
the name The Quarrymen actually comes from the school song.
It comes from the school song, yeah. There are several of my former colleagues who lay claim to having thought of the name.
Right.
But the school song runs, Quarrymen old before our birth, straining each muscle and sinew. And Pete Shotton says, John says, I'm not straining a muscle or a sinew for anybody. So it's ironic.
Yeah.
And when we've been to America quite a few times, and people say, John must have really been proud of his school to call the band after the school. No.
No, he wasn't.
It wasn't. It was sarcasm. So
tell us, for those who wouldn't be familiar with skiffle music, what is skiffle music?
Well, do you want the 15-minute lecture or the 2-minute?
Give us the 2 minutes. Give us the 2 minutes.
I'll give you the 2 minute.
Yeah.
OK, I'll spare you the 15 minutes. The New Orleans jazz bands in England in the early 50s, they used to take a break so the horn players' lips could recover.
Yes, yeah.
So in the break, somebody would pick up a guitar, the bass player would come in, maybe somebody would pick up a washboard, and they would play bluesy stuff in the break. And this became a very popular feature with their fans. And apparently, this is the story I've read anyway, it's due to Billy Bragg's book all about skiffle, how skiffle changed the world. One of the skiffle groups, one of these groups was on a BBC programme, and the producer said, well, what do you call this group? And they said, we call it the Breakdown Group. So the producer said, well, that's not, it's not exactly inspiring, not catchy, absolutely. Can you come up with something else? Well, one of the guys in the group, Bill Collier, worked in a record shop, and he'd seen a 78 called Dan Burley and his Skiffle Boys. Because skiffle was a name for a rent party in Chicago. You know, if you couldn't pay the rent, you got a load of cheap booze and invited all your friends, and they paid $1 or so.
And it was a skiffle party.
And that was a skiffle party.
Okay.
So it was really a name for a party, and then the music played at the party.
Wow.
It's called skiffle.
Brilliant.
And of course, the music in England was quite different from the American stuff, because that was largely piano-based. But that's the 2-minute version.
McCartney and his introduction to the group. Tell us about that
well, you
meeting.
can ask me, but...
you mightn't tell us.
Well, I can tell you what I know. We were on a Q&A session at the Beatles convention in America, and there were all the 5 of us there who were on stage with John that day.
Yeah.
And the interviewer said, oh, now you can tell us what really happened. And I was the nearest one to the interviewer, so I started. And I said, well, look, I don't even remember seeing Paul McCartney that day. During the famous introduction, I probably went home for me tea, as we say in Liverpool. So that, you got a snigger out of you, but there you go. So the next time, out of sheer devilment, I said, I probably went for a pee, the vital moment in rock and roll history, you see, which did get a snigger out of the audience. And that is now myth now. There's an American guy done this beautiful acrylic painting of John and Paul being introduced, and there's even a copy of it on the wall in St. Peter's Church Hall where they met. And he sent me a JPEG of it, and he said, there's all the guys there. There's John being introduced to Paul, there's Ivan Vaughan, etc. And your banjo's lying on the chair. But I didn't put you in the picture because I was there when you said you were in the bathroom at the time. So that's, you have to be very careful.
What was John like growing up?
He was... I got on with him pretty well, possibly because we'd known each other since we were very small.
You were 5,
he could be very difficult. He was what you would call a disruptive pupil, basically. He was a pain in the proverbial for most of his.
Well, could you see something even back then, John?
Well, he was a brilliant caricaturist. Okay, I mean, you know, approaching the Gerald Scarfe quality.
Wow.
And he could have made a fortune as a caricaturist. But the rest of his talent was really disruption and messing about, you know. Sometimes brilliantly, and sometimes really, you know, nearly giving mental breakdowns to some of the teachers. I do have a story which is from Pete Shotton. When people say, "What was he really like?" You see.
Yes.
I don't know how you come on with disreputable language on Irish TV. Anyway, we'll see what we can do. So we were at this...
We'll hold our breath.
Beatle convention in Nottingham, and the inevitable question, what was John Lennon really like, you see? So the rest of us stepped back and let Pete get on with it, because obviously he was the man who should know. And he said, well, I was in a pub the other day, and somebody came up to me and said, hey, you were John Lennon's best mate. What was he really like? I heard he was a bit of a bastard, you see. So all these Beatles fans at this convention, God almighty, you know, huge gasp of horror came up, you see. So Pete says, well, I said to this bloke, you know, prodding him, I said to this bloke, do you realise you're talking about my best friend from childhood, my bosom buddy, the man who with his music has given more people more pleasure since the world began. A lovely big glow came up from the audience. And Pete says, yeah, you're right, though, he was a bit of a bastard. we all fell off the stage.
You're going to be sharing stories and songs
like
and music like that today in Last Lane in Dublin.
That's just a snippet of what people can expect this afternoon, isn't it, Rod?
Yeah, I'll try not to embroider it too much for this afternoon, OK?
We really appreciate you coming in. Thanks, Rod.
Thank you.
Good to see you.
Thank you, Rod. A pleasure. Now, you can get tickets for an afternoon with Rod Davis of the Quarrymen today at 3 p.m. at lostlane.ie.